I want to welcome all the panelists and participants on this webinar today. As Bhavna and Ravi have mentioned, we are celebrating 50 years in India for WWF. This has been quite a journey all these years, where we have had the opportunity to not only contribute towards conservation of wildlife, which has been a large part of our program, but also get involved in many, many other activities. And when we look at the map of India and in all the places that WWF-India is having a presence, you can see a dot practically all over the country. And of course, it is heavily favored with the national parks and protected areas, but increasingly now in wetlands, in a very robust marine program. I think the involvement of communities, especially in mangrove areas like the Sundarbans, which are highly susceptible to climate change and seawater rise. I mean, these are some of the wide variety of actions that WWF India has taken. And I'm really happy and proud that we have achieved so much over these years. And thanks to our supporters, of course, and to our staff and to all the board members who've been on the WWF board from the inception. And, one of the things that we are always asked is that why is it that WWF engages so much with the corporate sector? And I think that coming from an industry background myself, I realize that, and this is something that I, constantly say in any of the programs of the Confederation of Indian Industry, that industry has so much to contribute. And also because industry has been responsible for many of the problems that we face today, not just of pollution and the environment and issues to do with energy issues. But I think that industry has not had a clear direction the way that they have now and have for the last many years. I mean, it's so wonderful when we can engage with some of the most important brand names in the world who use cotton, use palm oil, use crops like sugar in their food preparation. I mean, it is such a wide variety of interventions that WWF India and WWF all over the world engage in. That is really so satisfying. And we have such dedicated and wonderful researchers and field workers. And I really do appreciate all of them, and especially our current board. And this is important that I mentioned that Ravi Singh has been with us for many years now, and I hope he will be with us for many more years. And but his contribution also has been enormous in bringing WWF to a wonderful and stable position that it is in today. So let me say a few words about the topic and the green recovery and the pandemic, etc. I think we all, have been bombarded with this question of what is it you're interested in really? Are you interested in jobs? Are you interested in livelihoods? Are you interested in lives? And the answer to all these questions is that we are interested in all of the above. I mean, I don't think that anyone could ever say that, lives are more important than livelihoods or livelihoods are more important than lives. They are all equally important. But I think when we think about this problem, whether it's in India or anywhere else, I think we have to realize that the pandemic has also thrown up so many vulnerabilities that we have, and we find ourselves vulnerable to many uh, issues to do with, say, migrant labor, uh, to do with you know how we deal with day-to-day issues of food and transport. And it's interesting to note that most economies in the world have learned many things, but I think that if I won't be honest if I don't say that our friends and citizens, co-citizens in Delhi, seem to have thrown caution to the wind and decided that celebrating Diwali is probably more important than worrying about the pandemic. So this is one of the reasons why Delhi is having a spike in cases again. But I think that we all realize that basic issues such as wearing masks, etc., are so crucial at a time when we know that the vaccine is around the corner. But we also realize the challenge that when we have 1.3 billion people to be vaccinated, it's going to take a while. I think if when we look at green growth, I think we have to, first focus on jobs and bringing business and industry and economic activity back. But that's easier said than done. And I think there are many good ideas that have been talked about over the years. Uh, I would put that India has done well in areas like renewable energy, and Mr. Suman Sinha is of course a leader in that area, and we will hear more about that from him. Uh, but we also realize that whilst the pandemic is going on, the sudden spurt of activity in Delhi and environment factors such as agriculture burning, etc., have all resulted in a terrible air quality in Delhi. And this is one thing that we don't seem to have been able to find solutions to easily. I think air quality, unfortunately, India is, home to 80% of the top cities in the world, which have a serious air pollution problem. Uh, and I think this is something that is very much in our hands. And when we talk of green growth, we have to involve every single person, whether it is policymakers and government, it is agricultural farmers in Punjab and Haryana around Delhi. Every single person needs to be involved in finding these type of solutions. And we do find very often that it's a all of the above type of attitude and approach that leads to finding uh, easy solutions or even difficult solutions, but we have to find involve a large number of people in it. uh, I would say that when you really look at how industry can react, I think first of all, uh, there are many leading companies in the world that already have good programs to find their way to net zero by 2050. But as I always say, uh, I'm not sure if I'm going to be around in 2050 to see that. And what I would like to see actually is something unique happening in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years, where we can put significantly ambitious targets for a 5 year or a 10-year program on reduction. The European Union, for instance, has talked about a 60% reduction in carbon intensity by 2030. I think those are the uh, sort of intermediate goals that we should be aiming to find solutions for, which is here and now. And I know that we have to achieve net zero by 2050 if we want, the temperature rise uh, by the turn of the century to stay within 1.5 degrees. Even that is a challenge now. And but uh, I think if we don't look at near-term goals and near-term solutions, you know, it was very easy to talk of a distant goal or a distant solution, but then the focus doesn't remain on it. So let me end here, Ravi, and can now invite your next panelist.
Thank you, Jamshed, and thank you for the comments from WWF-India. And thank you. It's great to have you talk about that, and of course, the contributions of the board to the organization all through these years. May I now request Mr. Surendra Rosha to come in and give his comments. And we may also get a chance to talk about this a little later, but I'll leave you the choice. I know that, and all of us have read about the ambitions that HSBC have set itself. And you may like to talk a bit about that and also the thinking behind it. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ravi, and congratulations to WWF-India for the 50th anniversary. Look, I think, as Jamshed said, we've seen the impact of this pandemic across a variety of aspects of our lives. And really, it's no longer a debate about lives versus livelihoods. It is very much about getting both going and how do we sustain that through the future. I mean, if you look at my hometown of Mumbai, where, during the period of April to June, I saw the bluest skies I've seen in my adult life. It was very clear that, how do you get that sort of environment on a permanent basis, right? So I think there is enough and more interest for an organization like us because our customers are interested. So when we did a survey of our corporate customer base globally, 85% of them said that sustainability of the environment is a key concern for them as a strategic imperative. Now, this is a huge group, right? When we think about this across 60 countries. When we look at our retail customer base, which is about 40 million individuals who bank with us globally, again, this has been a topic that has come up and increasingly is appearing in more and more countries as well. So for a financial institution like us not to respond to that would mean that we are tone deaf, and hopefully we aren't that. So we really looked at our role in enabling this. And therefore the first step that was committed to was really around our own operations and our supply chain and getting that to net zero by 2030. And perhaps a significant step to my mind, which was away from what perhaps was done by financial services in the past, because in the past, if you didn't want to finance a carbon emitting industry, you just stopped lending them money, or you didn't invest in the transition. And what we've done, and I think other financial institutions are also doing, is really now talking about how do we partner with our customers suppliers, their distributors, etc., to really think about a sustainable supply chain, a sustainable operation, and helping the transition from where they are today to a net zero outcome. And in that process, and Jamshed made a very valid point to setting mid milestones that you could observe progress against. Because when you say something is going to be 30 years from now, and we are all used to producing results for the next quarter and so on, gets lost. So we really do need to think about what are we going to do in 2021, what are we going to do in 2022, and so on, and set progress in that fashion. And I do think again that even in India, financial services can play a significant role in being a catalyst in this journey, working closely with the government, in our case also with the Reserve Bank, etc., to ensure that policy is enabling or incentivizing these changes. So we are really excited about this, but I don't want to in any way sort of reduce the challenges in front of us. They are significant. Look, a lot of people have lost their jobs. A lot of our industries and sectors are in a significantly stressed situation, which needs to be addressed. And it's not like once the vaccine is approved that things are going to turn around. It'll take time. So how do we support that? The second challenge I would put forward is that if you learn from the experience of globalization, we also need to be mindful that as the transition happens, that communities and countries are not left behind and then start to resent the underlying initiative itself. So it's really important to think about building back in a way that is truly inclusive. I'll stop there. Pass it back to you, Ravi. Thank you. Sorry, Ravi, you're on mute.
Sorry. I said we'll come back to some of the comments in the following conversation. Thank you. Very leading analysis in some of them. Mr. Suman Sinha, thank you for being here, and we'd like you to share some of your insight on the topic. Over to you. You're on mute, sir.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ravi, and I'd like to congratulate both you as well as WWF-India for 50 years. Congrats to Jamshed as well for heading the board. All of you have done an outstanding job. And thank you so much for organizing this webinar and for inviting me to speak at it. I feel that there are many things at play here. And in a way, I think COVID has given us the occasion or the opportunity over the last many months to take a step back on the whole climate change conversation and also on the sustainability issues. And as Surendra rightly said, we saw such clear skies in Delhi, which is my hometown, unfortunately, that we had not seen for a very long time. And through the summer, I could see from my apartment on the 17th floor, distances that I could not see earlier at all. I saw that there was a ridge in the distance that I could never see earlier, that there were trees I could make out individually. So lots of little things came to the fore. And I was hoping that this year, October, November, might somehow miraculously be different from every other October, November. But alas, that was not to be. We've had the same pollution and the same hazy skies and the same problems in the quality of air that we've had in every year so far. It's perhaps been a little bit less polluted than most years, but it's still quite awful, unfortunately. So I think it's a grim reminder that, economic activity is picking up, and as it is, all the same old problems are going to come back and face us as they had been in front of us for so many years. I think, having said that, over the last 2-3 years, there is some good news that is emerging. And the good news is basically that we are now having an alignment of what is good for the economy with what is commercially good for the economy. And that alignment is very important because it takes away the heavy lifting from government policy making and puts it more in the hands of corporates, people, individuals, the whole economic system. Because there is now a real incentive for us to move to try to decarbonize the economy. So I think that is in some ways step one of what needs to happen as we build back post-COVID in the recovery. There is an opportunity for us to decarbonize the energy systems much more rapidly than we had earlier thought. And that's something that we should really grasp by the horns and really move forward very rapidly. So I think that is one thing that we definitely need to do. The second thing that we need to do is we need to deepen electrification. Today, we have electricity accounting for only a quarter of total energy consumption. The balance comes from areas like mobility, whether it's automobile transportation or aviation, shipping, etc. But I think there is a real chance here to take that quarter percentage of energy and increase that significantly more. And as that happens, and as more sectors move into electricity within the energy ambit, and we can then decarbonize the electricity part, which is easier to do, then automatically you lead to a situation where you'll be building back in a greener manner. And that is, as I said, very essential. Um, the third thing is for sectors of the economy which are harder to electrify, how do you deal with those parts of the economy? And those are issues, areas like the hard to abate sectors like steel and cement, and the balance of the transportation sector like aviation or marine and so on. And so there, I think the a new solution is also beginning to emerge, which is currently much more expensive, but over time is going to become cheaper. And that is the area of hydrogen, and green hydrogen in particular. And I think that is going to become, over the next 5 to 10 years, a potential new solution that can really help us move forward on the decarbonization path. So I think these three things that are happening give me personally a lot of hope and optimism that we can in fact very significantly change the current construct of the economies, which are all based on fossil fuels, and really move away from that into a much greener situation. And as you know, energy accounts for almost 75% of all carbon emissions. So if we can take first the 25% of that that is coming from electricity, and then the balance of it, and make that significantly less carbon intensive and eventually carbon free, then that begins to offer us pathways, and very commercially viable pathways, to getting to net zero eventually. And for a country like India, where the conversation around net zero has not even yet begun, except for the bolder among us like Jamshed, who talked about it in his opening comments. Certainly, the good news is that China is now talking about going net zero after the Western world has also put those targets out there. India is not so far doing it. But I think where we can start looking at in the Indian context is to start thinking about things like peak coal or peak oil. And once we get to those peak levels, then we can start getting to maybe net zero coal at some point in time. And so we need to deconstruct the net zero target into, first the peak, cross the peak, and then start looking at individually bringing down some of the carbon intensive fossil fuels. And then once we have that, then I think net zero becomes a much more viable proposition. And I'm hopeful that just given the way technology is evolving, and just given the commercial rationales that are now developing for some of the less carbon intensive technologies, I'm hopeful that it might still happen, that we start seeing a significant movement towards this in our lifetimes. Again, to echo the point that Jamshed was making, that we might not see it in our lifetimes, but I'm hopeful that we might see a substantial move in that direction. And because I have been, operating in the area of renewable energy over the last 10 years, we've seen such rapid reductions in the costs of these technologies, which I think has been pleasantly shocking for everybody. That if one were to have the same kind of improvements in things like hydrogen, or making intermittency management a little bit easier, let's say in renewables, or electric automobiles becoming much more common and cheaper and better, then you'll start seeing a lot of consumer pull in emerging as well, and a much stronger development in this direction as far as we are concerned, as our economies are concerned. So I am optimistic that India is standing at this cusp where we are ahead on a number of these areas compared to a lot of the developing countries. Of course, we are behind some of the developed countries in some of these areas. Not that far behind, mind you, and that's the good news. But we are in some ways on the cusp where these technologies are just coming in. And therefore, India is in some ways going to become this massive laboratory, or this crucible, where all of these things are going to come in and almost become, we'll almost become the first economy where all of these new technologies are, implemented in mass, such that we become the first economy that starts moving in a much less carbon intensive manner. And that then becomes a beacon for a lot of the other emerging market countries out there. And so I think this is an opportunity that India has to grasp by the scruff of its neck, and really capitalize on it. It's rare that a country gets an opportunity like this that we have got at this point in time. And perhaps I'm overstating this point a little bit, but I just want to emphasize it as well, because it does seem to me that these new technologies is an area where India has got scale. We've made a lot of, we've done a lot of the early running in it. And now we have the opportunity of really, really helping scale these technologies up, and in some ways becoming a leader in these new technologies and new manufacturing. And therefore, I must say that, with all the issues and so on, this is one area where the government has done really, really good work, where they've helped scale up renewable energy quite substantially. The Prime Minister has taken a personal interest and he set these massive targets. That is helping us scale the industry up. And the government is now trying to create a domestic manufacturing industry with the production linked incentive scheme, the talk about customs duties to protect the domestic market. So there's a real push under this whole program of Atmanirbhar Bharat to have more manufacturing set up, which then allows India potentially to have the opportunity of becoming a hub for manufacturing for global exports, as well as serving the large domestic market. So I think it's a very optimistic time for us in India in this whole sector, and we can really take this as a great opportunity to grow and at first decarbonize our own economy, and then create industries that can really help us grow, create millions and millions of jobs in the future, and really become, be on the vanguard of taking the lead in going carbon free, both in the world in general and certainly among the developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sinha. That was very deep. Thank you for the vast coverage of your thinking and your guidance. We'll come back to some of those points. And I would now go to Margaret Coulomb for her comments and remarks. Margaret, some of these comments that have been made may be quite new to you. The terminologies of Atmanirbhar Bharat, which is a program by the government, led by the Prime Minister to upgrade certain sectors of our economy and industry, so as not to be entirely dependent on external markets, and yet give us competitiveness in the global economic scenario. But you're not new to a number of these concepts, and I certainly look forward to your comments and remarks in this regard. Thank you. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Ravi, and happy birthday. Congratulations to you. Thank you very much for inviting me to share the celebration. I can tell you from experience, your 50th is a really great time to celebrate, enjoy, and hopefully here's to another 50 more. I'm struck in the conversation that, and I think we see this all over the world. COVID-19 has really made us all sort of step back, notice the difference in the world around us as economic activity and mobility reduces. You get cleaner air. Here where I am, I've been enjoying the backyard birds with my children, which is a tremendous joy, I have to say. And you're just struck by the challenge of this health crisis, the challenge of the economic crisis that has come from trying to address the health crisis, and struggling with a sort of underlying optimism, actually, because it has given us a view to how the world could look different. And I think a lot of people, as they think about building back, talk a lot about building back better, are actually thinking about how do we return differently? Because we've seen that the world could be a little bit different. We see the opportunities for the world to be a better place. How do we all go back to work, to do the things we really enjoy, that are fulfilling on a personal level, and also obviously critical for livelihoods? How do we do that in a way that also continues to enable us to enjoy a bit cleaner air? and a little bit more birdsong. So I think it's helpful to think about the COVID crisis as these two distinct crises. There's the health crisis, clearly with global impact. There's an economic crisis, also clearly with a global impact, both interrelated. And every country is in a different stage in how they're addressing that crisis. Some still deep in the health crisis, trying to make sure on the fiscal side that there's just liquidity in the market, trying to make sure on the economic side that there are resources to people who are out of work, who either can't go to work or whose jobs have closed up. And some are already starting to think about what does next look like. And for the countries seriously looking now at the economic recovery, and maybe recent vaccine news gives us a little hope that that recovery is a little closer than we thought. Although, I think you're right to point out this is going to be much more complex than we think, but it's not going to be 5 years probably. The packages are critical. The recovery packages are critical, both for the economy, for jobs, and for livelihoods. They need to be effective not only in restarting the economy, but in building the sustainable economy that we need to make us more resilient to the next crisis. So just not too far south from where I am right now, we've just seen two extremely strong hurricanes, one right after the other, over roughly the exact same place. Extremely difficult times over the last several weeks in Central America. The warming waters, this is one of the most active hurricane seasons on record, and the warming waters that we've seen is just going to increase the probability of more larger, more destructive storms. And we know that the rate of deforestation and habitat destruction is also increasing the probability of pandemic spillover events like what we're seeing right now with COVID-19. So recovery needs to build in prevention, and this includes reducing GHG emissions to meet the targets of Paris, and also hold back the worst of the physical impacts of climate change. It also includes investing in our natural resources and all the services they provide, or nature-based solutions for climate. So the latest stimulus index, there's a group called Vivid Economics that has put together a stimulus index, green stimulus index, together with Finance for Biodiversity. And it shows there's been almost $13 trillion committed in stimulus funding so far. About 500 billion of that is green stimulus, so-called, and only about 93 billion of that is targeted specifically to biodiversity. That analysis also found the announced stimulus packages will have a net negative environmental impact in 16 of the 20 G20 economies. So clearly there was a need in the first instance really to push liquidity, then to push as much economic relief as possible to address immediate job impacts. We now need to make sure that recovery packages aren't building in more of the damage that we're already trying to come back from. So I think leaders are starting to pay attention. People now realize that our own human health is really intricately involved, linked to our relationship with the natural world. And during the week of the UN General Assembly in September, leaders came together for a UN summit on biodiversity, and political leaders representing about 77 countries from all regions of the world signed something called a Leaders' Pledge for Nature. And the first commitment in that pledge is to ensure that the response to the current health and economic crises is green and just to the point of bringing people along, and contributes directly to recovering better and achieving sustainable society. So I think the commitment's there, the realization clearly is there across multiple sectors, and now we really need to translate that commitment and that realization into more purposeful recovery packages.
Yeah, Ravi?
I think
I
we
think he's probably
perhaps
had a
lost
power
Ravi.
outage.
I think he got disconnected.
Oh, okay.
I think he should be joining back shortly. But
Yeah.
in the meantime, I think what we could do is we could go on to some of the specific questions that we can have. Oh,
Yeah, he's back. Ravi's back.
I had a power outage in my area, so the power has just come back. I'm sorry about that. I'm on backup now, so backups work. So, may I heard almost to the end of what Margaret had commented, so let me just go back now specifically to the panelists in the same order, and perhaps ask some questions that also cover some of our thoughts and what some of our people, some people WWF have been asking. And one of the, may I ask Mr. Godrej, he had commented on this briefly. What could spur this shift? What could make the key changes, or not just the inflection, but the spur it in economies like India or larger economies of the world, that we move towards a, let's say, a mid-term kind of a goal to a greener economy or a more sustainable economy. We've been talking about this. I know you've been commenting in a number of areas on panels as well. But what could spur it? What could really inspire and make us get into areas of action?
Yeah, thanks, Ravi. You know, I do believe that this last 6-8 months, you know, the awareness has been fast-tracked. I think it's not just what we were talking about of blue skies and clean water and things like that. For instance, you and I talked about the fact that for the last 50 years, we've been trying to have programs to clean the Ganga, which is of great significance in India. And immediately, within 3 months of the pandemic hitting, we were able to achieve some of the water quality in the river, which we have not seen for 40 years. And how did that happen? You know, and it clearly pointed that because industrial activity had almost come to a standstill, you know, all those pollutants were not getting into the water. Now, I think we know many of these, you know, sort of answers in terms of where we need to attack. I think the biggest challenge will be getting our political and administrative, you know, leaders in the country to also appreciate that whilst we have to have growth and get jobs and livelihoods and everything back online, you know, that if we don't also address this issue of how to build in sustainability into these plans, you know, we will fail even in the short term, the medium term. And so I would say that there are two things of crucial importance. And since all of you have so much experience on finance and banking and you know, I'm going to suggest that, you know, we have not been able to convince the financial sector of the importance of sustainability when they lend money. I think they are aware of it. It's not that they don't know anything about it. They are very well aware of it. I think the problem always is that, you know, of course, banking has to return money to its depositors, but at the same time, you know, it also has the responsibility, as Surendra said, to all its stakeholders. And how do we bring that in? You know, I mean, this is a complicated process. You know, for instance, in the past, the World Bank took a stand. You know, that they would not finance coal-fired power plants. or they would not finance dams, large dams. So something similar to that. Of course, we know that there were others who picked up that finance instead of the World Bank. But my question is, how do we involve the finance sector in making this much deeper? In when they lend money, when they are intermediaries with businesses, how that their voice is very important. I mean, no business runs without money and finance, etc. So I'm sure that we are doing some of that, but how do we get that deeper? And whilst we're doing that, we need to make sure that the stakeholders, which is the government, which is industry, which are all our consumers, etc., can appreciate it. I'll only give you one example of what's been happening, say in the home appliance industry. When about 10 years ago, this idea that we should have energy rating system for home appliances was a very new idea everywhere. It had started in some places, but I think the home appliance industry in India, took it on with great gusto. And in the first few years, we found that consumers were very keen to buy high energy rated appliances. They wanted that 5-star. I think it was also something of pride for them that they were having something with a 5-star rating, etc. And the reason why it worked was because that the premium that the consumer paid, for that product was quite small in relation to the saving that they would get over the life of the product, say over 5 years, or in India typically 10 years for a large durable. And consumers and dealers in the industry were very quick to pick this up, that there is a financial benefit to being a 5-star product. This is the sort of example that I think that we need to replicate in more and more sectors of industry. So how do we do that? For instance, the auto industry, had to, by regulation, they were forced to skip from, directly from BS4 to BS6, by skipping over BS5, because we'd lost a lot of time in getting our auto industry to move fast. And now suddenly, by the time before they've even done that, everyone in the world is talking about electric. And I mean, it's just amazing to note that a company like Tesla has a higher market cap today than almost all its competitors put together. I mean, it's something, it's an idea that consumers and, regulators and others have picked up very quickly and moved with it. So I think this is the sort of thing that we need for transformative change, and the more and more sectors that we can identify for transformative change, would be really good. I mean, Suman talked about the fact that the Prime Minister in India has put these horrendous targets, on moving from fossil-based fuels to renewables. And that's a huge spurt for business to look at, that, this is the size of the opportunity, but it's also something good. It's renewables, it's solar, it's wind, it's biomass, whatever. So I think this is the sort of thing that we should continuously talk of. One of the things we've also talked of in WWF is that if all the power plants which are 20 years or older are retired, just imagine, how much improvement there would be in the air quality where these plants are, and subsequently, in other areas, and create this huge market for renewables. So these are the sort of things I think that we should be looking at to spur this growth along.
Thank you, Mr. Godrej. Thank you for that response. May I now request Mr. Surendra Rosha to perhaps talk about two areas which are important, which come up often. And one is the role of the finance sector as far as the SMEs are concerned in this whole process of transforming India to a greener economy. Sometimes the SME sector gets left behind, although they have a lot of role to play, particularly in taking risks with their capital or with the amount of employment that they have to contribute to the country. And to some extent, to comment on how or will COVID-19 affect the pandemic, some of those aspects that Margaret also spoke about, will also accelerate and transform the climate finance or the transition landscape that you commented on earlier. Thank you.
Thanks, Ravi. So just on SMEs, it is really an interesting segment of the economy. It will need a lot more help, just simply because of the scale and the ability to transition for them, or even in fact as manufacturing processes move to India and supply chains move, how do those at last leg as the SME comes in, how are they more sustainable? I think there are two ways in which the industry can play a role here. One clearly is that we see experience across industries, across geographies, which can result in some level of sharing of information and creating forums through which there is a best practice code that is shared across. But with the government, we will need to put in place policies that support these SMEs. So we've seen during the pandemic, a lot of the government's fiscal effort going towards supporting the SMEs financially or ensuring they have access to credit. Now, this was the short-term requirement because there was a freezing up of credit lines that was happening as banks grew averse or risk averse. So I think in a similar way, the industry, as the financial services industry, will have to work with the government on determining long-term policies. So just to give you one example, in Indian banking today, for every dollar or every rupee that we lend, we have to do 40 paisa or 40% of that as priority sector lending, right? How do we marry transition for SMEs with the need for that finance and prioritize that? Could we put it on par with small and marginal farmers or agriculture, et cetera, which are high priority financial goals of the regulator, and therefore enable or incentivize the industry also to move towards and focus towards this segment? So I think that there needs to be a two-pronged process in my view. One, there is a industry-led response around trying to make sure we're creating the forums for sharing ideas. And then, of course, the second aspect being that we work with the regulators and the government to create policies that incentivize. Ravi, you'll have to repeat your second question. My memory fails me. Sorry.
This was regarding looking at the, you spoke about transition and helping institutions and companies to transit into. Now, transition is now based.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry.
No, I was just going to say that in that context, we should look at the wider financial services industry, not just necessarily banks. And the reason I say this is because, Jamshed used the Tesla example. If you've been a shareholder in Tesla, you've seen outsized returns for the auto industry, right? And therefore, how do you look at investors in these companies or in these industries getting the benefit of that transition as well? Because there is going to be an incentive to use more market or move more market share into that space. So a good example of this is recently the UK has announced that one of the 10 points for a greener UK is that they will stop allowing the sale of petrol and diesel cars from 2030. Now that will naturally force companies to look at more sustainable alternatives for mobility, and investment flows will also move towards that direction. So I think today we have to align sustainability with the wider ESG goals that investors have, and ensure that we capture that bucket of investment globally. More and more funds are being allocated to that vertical. And I think India can really access that for its infrastructure development, for the transition, by ensuring these funds are able to flow into to start off larger companies and then through them lower down. In terms of financial services, there is scope for innovation. Banking can be boring, but we do see innovation. We've launched recently in India a green deposit product, which effectively allows companies who require to place their money in green assets to place deposits with us, and we confirm that we will be only financing sustainable projects or sustainable green assets through that process. Now, it's a small piece of innovation, but really, I think India has an immense scope for and scale to allow for that kind of innovation to come through. So as we look at on the renewable side, what's happened, government policy, entrepreneurs like Sumant coming in to build scale, and then the financial services industry lending into that, either through the bond markets or loans, we could see that replicate in hydrogen and other areas as well.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you. Mr. Sumant, now over to you. We'd like to, some questions are coming in, so I might combine one or two of my questions with those. And you spoke about, the low carbon pathway and decarbonization of the sector and so forth. Is there, I know it's a difficult question, and I have two for you. Do you see some kind of a timeline, and I'll come back to this. Do you see some kind of timeline in terms of the green energy, the innovation, thousands of things that are happening in India at this point of time to take us ahead, which we do a lot, but we don't talk about it to the rest of the world. And this is one of the things that we do all the time. But on this, the transition, the movement for renewable energy, the industry and the sector that you're in, I mean, how far ahead do you see this? If we think back, this conversation perhaps would have been very theoretical in India 10 years ago. And now perhaps you could give us some kind of an idea what it will be like in 10 years from now. And secondly, and this comes about quite often, you may want to talk a bit about hydrogen for India. I mean, this has been mentioned, but I've broad-based that a bit more, please. Thank you. You're on mute, sir.
Yeah, well, thank you, Ravi. I can talk about this question that you asked me at length. I've just written a book about this as well, and so therefore it's all fresh in my mind. But just very simply, you're absolutely right when you say that 10 years ago we would have been having a very different conversation. All of this would have been a pie in the sky. People would have said you're crazy. Probably would have been burnt at the stake or something like that. It's a very different environment now. And frankly, all of this has happened in the last 2 or 3 years. And that is why, what we don't realize, Ravi, is that we are living in the midst of a transition that has happened perhaps twice in our history before, when we migrated from biomass into coal, and then maybe about 150 years ago, and that led to the steam engine and locomotives and a whole new civilizational imperative that developed from there. And then, let's say 50 to 100 years ago, and I'm deliberately being vague in my timelines a little bit, when we went into the oil revolution, and that again totally transformed the world. We are living through the midst of a similar transition, where our energy systems are moving from these fossil fuel-based systems to renewable energy. And the reason we are not able to understand this is because obviously, while it may seem obvious 50 or 100 years later, these things do take a few years to play out. And while you're in the middle of that, you don't really, read the tea leaves fast enough. So 2-3 years ago, renewable energy crossed the cost curve of coal and became cheaper, just in terms of pure generation. Before that, the whole conversation about renewables used to be that, it's more expensive, it requires government subsidies to survive and all of that. But now there is a clear commercial rationale. Anybody who wants to have new energy should just simply go for renewable energy. I mean, there is just, there's no thinking about that. So that's I think the first thing that has happened. But as we look at the future now, what is increasingly becoming clear is that, as you know, one of the biggest disadvantages of renewable energy is its intermittency. The fact that you can't control it. You know, the sun shines when it does, the wind blows when it does. And so you have to just take the power when it's generated and push it into the grid, and people have to use it at that point in time or it gets lost. In the case of coal, that is obviously not the case. You burn the, you operate a thermal power plant when you need the actual power. And so you can match it better against your demand curve. Now what is happening is, just given how much lower on a pure generation basis, if coal is at 5 rupees per unit today, uh, solar is at half of that, at 2.5 rupees. Wind is at 3 or 3.25 rupees. So the gap between, in terms of pure generation cost, the gap has become so large that it is now opening up space for us to come up with intermittency management solutions. And that 2 rupees gap that we now have allows us to start managing this intermittency to a very large extent. And we all know that batteries are also becoming cheaper. As costs of batteries come down, that intermittency management cost will also become less. And so therefore, you'll have a situation in maybe 2 to 3 years from now where the cost of firm renewables, not intermittent renewables, but firm renewables, becomes significantly inside coal-based power. And from that point on, there is going to be zero rationale to set up any coal-based power plants, because when I give you the cost of coal, I'm not costing in the externality of the emissions problems and the health problems and all of those things. I'm not even doing that, right? And also the fact that potentially coal in India is mined by a government agency, and therefore, what the pricing of that is also not that transparent. So it's going to become cheaper. So therefore, from that point on, it is going to have to be renewables. Now, I'll just give you a very simple data point, Ravi, although I've given you a few so far already. But just one more is that today, the global installed capacity of power in the world is 6,000 gigawatts. In India, by the way, it's about close to about 400 gigawatts. So we are about 6 or 7% of the total power generating capacity globally. What is forecast now is that in the next 30 to 40 years, we will have to set up just renewable capacity, which is 5 or 6 times the existing capacity of all power generation. And that's going to be a mammoth task. It's going to require an investment amount of $1 to $1.2 trillion globally every year. And in India, about maybe $200 to $300 billion every year. Now, that is equal to the total global investment that takes place in the oil and gas industry, as well as currently the entire power sector. So that's the size of this industry that is going to have to develop just to meet future demand growth in power, as well as replace existing legacy capacities in coal-based generation that we have. Now, there are going to be enormous challenges because, number one, we just don't have the execution capacity. We don't have equipment manufacturing of sufficient quantity, and we don't have financing. So there are many, many things that need to come into alignment for this to happen. But that is why it's going to be an incredibly exciting sector, I think, over time. And within this, there'll be these phenomenal technology leaps that will also get taken. One of those, which is the second part of the question that you asked me, is hydrogen. Hydrogen is still a few years out. So I don't think it's going to be a real viable, practical solution for India, at least for the next 5 to 10 years. But I think it will start getting into deployment in the Western world. And as that begins to happen, and as the cost of the equipment comes down, it will start becoming viable in India also. But as I said, it will take a little bit more time. Now, what is going to happen between now and then is that we are going to have in the gas sector in India, which is where, in the gas and the petroleum sector, which is where hydrogen becomes a replacement, and green hydrogen particularly, you will start seeing the evolution of a similar kind of industry, where in renewables, you first had renewable purchase obligation standards because it was clean, but it was more expensive. So the government had to mandate. The same thing will happen to green hydrogen in the context of natural gas. So all the piped gas that you see going to people's homes, suddenly the government will start mandating that you need to have a certain amount of green hydrogen. And they'll start asking you to blend it. And it's going to be a little bit more expensive, but they'll start with 5%, 10%, and then take it up from there. And so that's going to be another big, huge opportunity that is going to develop. Give it another 5 to 10 years, and that will also be another interesting opportunity that is going to be around us. So I think there are going to be lots of very interesting things that are going to happen in the near term. And I think, for entrepreneurs who are willing to jump into this, it's a great opportunity to get involved. And for financiers like Surinder, who are obviously, operating in the sector, I think it's going to be something where they need to quickly segue a little bit faster, actually.
Thank you. Thank you. That was very good. Thank you. Very pointed, and thank you also for the data points. Margaret, now we need some comments from you. Firstly, you are hearing from practitioners. You're not hearing from people who are, just advocates or of policy, or people who are thought leaders. They are thought leaders, but they're also practitioners. I mean, they actually know what works in this area and how best it could be made to work. So we need some comments from you, because you may be also hearing certain things which are, in a way, leadership points for the whole globe, and how a country like ours, deeply stressed in a lot of areas, natural resources, and yet thinking to emerge in a very different way from others. But together with your comments, I'd just like to hear something from you about what are these areas of guidance, that you see. What are the points of action that the finance sector internationally can take in this transition? And I know that you worked on these aspects. Would you like to share some of your thoughts and experiences? Thank you. Over to you.
Sure. Thank you very much. I think I want to start on the leadership point, because I think in every sector, what you see about transition, speed of transition, depth of transition, is because someone decided that they needed to lead, that they needed to do things differently, that it was worth it taking the risk to be out in front. So I think that the leadership point is really clear. And if you look at virtually every company across industry, what you see is the people who really have made a difference is because someone at the top said we need to make a difference. I think it's also important, and there have been a number of examples given already, supportive government policy. And that can take two forms. There's getting rid of government policy that undermines leadership opportunities or forward action, builds in subsidies for activities that remain harmful. Some of the pricing examples were given, versus policy that supports transformation to new technology, investment in R&D, incentives on the short term as new technology takes hold, and then becomes more cost effective, even without the subsidies, as has been the experience across the globe. It's not just in India, across the globe on renewable energy. So I think those two pieces you really can't take out of any discussion: the role of leaders and the role of supportive government policy. The other point I would make, coming off of the one of the other points, is there are, and your earlier question, I think someone in the chat also asked, what can the finance sector do? There are increasingly innovative instruments to provide this kind of finance. I think green bonds are the most interesting and fast growing and interesting for a couple of reasons. One, because they've proven to be a strong financial asset. They're showing, as the volume of green bonds increases all over the world, the margins are actually positive, and there's tremendous amount of investor demand for green bonds. And that is shown in both the speed with which they're scooped up, and then the margins that are achieved in the pricing. The other thing about green bonds that has been really interesting, so they're structured. There's a set of green bond principles that have been propagated by the International Capital Markets Association. There are also domestic green bond principles in a number of markets. The the principles basically set out what's called a use of proceeds approach. So you can, upfront how the monies will be used in the bond. That's revolutionary actually for the bond market, and just creating that transparency, because it used to be you buy a bond and the bond would basically go into the general obligations of whatever, the entity, whether it's a corporate bond or a public bond. And you didn't have a sense for, beyond looking at the overall budget of the entity issuing the bond, how that money would be used. Green bonds introduced this tracing of the use of proceeds so that you can actually see how those monies have been used. And increasingly, depending on the strength of the green bond, the degree of greenness, if you will, you can also see the impact of that spending from an environmental perspective. So that as an innovative financial tool to help drive investment in more green activities, I think has been a really big development over the last, I think it was 10 years ago, roughly, that the World Bank issued the first green bond. And there also, just as we've seen a lot of the role of initial public sector support and supported policies for developing new technologies, same goes for financial instruments. The green bond comes out of the public financial industry and now is really widely used in private finance. So these are opportunities for leadership. The other thing that green bonds can do is start to help us get into other areas of investment that still look a little esoteric, a little risky, a little new, around, for example, nature-based solutions. So there's a lot of jobs in a recovery that come from investment in things like energy efficiency and clean energy, but also in natural infrastructure. So we just did a study with the ILO, the International Labor Organization, just about a month ago, I think. It showed there are about 1.2 billion jobs in sectors such as farming, fisheries, forestry, and tourism. And nature-based solutions can be harnessed to create employment while also protecting nature. They can also mitigate climate change and bring health benefits as well. And they include a lot of job-intensive activities like reforestation, watershed restoration, agroecological approaches in food production, which is a key sector in addition to energy that needs transformation. And some of these innovative financial instruments can also help spur investment in those sectors. Natural infrastructure like a mangrove, one of my favorite ecosystems for lots of reasons. The investment in mangroves, natural mangroves, and restoring the productivity of a natural mangrove can be more cost effective than gray infrastructure for storm surge management, for example. We have a lot of blended instruments in that space, and I think that's really the next frontier. If I go to your previous question about what are we looking at in 5 or 10 years, we're looking at a lot more understanding of how nature can also help us achieve our goals from a job perspective, from a health perspective, from a resilience perspective for climate, and innovative financial instruments to get more investment there. Thanks, Ravi.
Margaret, thank you. Very insightful. Thank you very much. I have two, while we turn into to some specific areas, we talked about figures and data points. There are some general questions, and these are coming both from the audience and from colleagues within WWF. And I'd like to throw this across to you because these are concerns of ours, and not specifically to anyone perhaps, but we'd like your comments on this. I think all of you can comment on this. The first is this issue of jobs. I mean, all of you mentioned this in some way or the other. Now, when you transit from one to the other, how would we, obviously the nuance is how do we manage it? When you close down a power plant or a not so efficient mine, and we move into larger opportunities, say in renewables, how do we manage the transition of jobs and lost income of the traditional industry. I know this has happened several times, and I think Mr. Sinha would have covered it in his book as well. But how do we manage this transition? Would you like to? Would like to go? I think. Sinha, would you like to comment?
Yeah, sure. So, well, it's obviously a terrific question because jobs are critical and we have to make sure that nobody is, no individual is put out of a job clearly. So I think that the way the transition will happen will, while in the historic terms, it will happen very quickly. In real practical terms, it will happen over several years. So I think that's one. We'll have time to manage this transition. The second thing is that even though there will be a replacement of coal, I think again it will take maybe a couple of decades before coal is phased out. So I think the first thing that will happen is in phase one, which is the next 10 years, you'll probably see coal, for example, growing in absolute terms, even though as a percentage in the energy mix it will come down. From 2030 to 2040, it'll probably plateau off, and then from 2040, it'll start coming down. So I think that what you'll have is no new jobs being created, but existing jobs will continue. So I think that's in some ways the good news, that there will be an opportunity for transition. If you look at other industries, for example, the electric vehicles industry, I think you'll have to have the existing employees or existing workers being retrained into new assembly lines which are based on electric mobility. So I think there'll probably be a seamless transition that is going to happen. Thirdly, I think that you'll have a lot of new jobs that will get created. And I know that what the government has started are these are various jobs councils, where the attempt is to train and retrain, perhaps in some cases, workers from within the industry, or get new workers to come in and train them for being prepared to deal with the challenges of new industries that are now being created. So I think we'll have enough time in this transition to make sure that there are no real job losses per se that will happen. And even if there are, we'll have enough time to retrain people and then move them into newer sectors. So I think, I don't think it'll be as stark a change as one might expect. I think it'll be something that we can manage and work around. But net, it'll create a number of new jobs, and that will really be just good for everybody.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. May I request Mr. Rosha to attempt the outside with just a little nuance that you need to, in the finance sector, there was a transition from a manual processing to a semi-manual to an automated. And now even the public sector banks are leading in certain products in those things. But how has this been managed, this transition, as far as jobs are concerned? We'd like your comments.
Sure. So I'll just add a point to what Sumant said, which I think from an India perspective is also important. We are a young country, and we are not a country which has a demographic challenge in that sense. So the need for reskilling is perhaps less than in other parts of the world. The challenge is more around new skilling. So as these new industries emerge, as new processes emerge, how do you repair a fuel battery versus a internal combustion engine, things like this. So there'll be a bit of that, but I agree with Sumant, it's not so much of a challenge in my view. Now, when we look at the financial services sector, yes, technologies come in. We can run branches much leaner than we could 20 years back, and so on. But increasingly, the consumer has also got much more discerning. So the effort you put in towards the front line, towards the interaction with either the corporate or the individual who's consuming your banking service is much more significant. And therefore, as an aggregate, I don't think that banking necessarily has reduced the total number of employment, the total employment that's happening in the country. And if I'd look more broadly, financial inclusion we've just started that journey 5-6 years ago. There's so much more to be done. If you think about insurance penetration, savings, etc., that there will be enough jobs in financial services. Again, I don't think that will necessarily be a challenge. So in many ways, we can learn from that to say that as new processes, new industries develop, we just need to ensure that industry bodies, government is supporting the skilling required to support the growth of that industry as well.
Thank you, sir. Well spoken. Well answered that. May I now toss the question, which is my last question to both Margaret and Mr. Godrej. And this is relating to management of waste, because the old economy, the so-called old economy, will have a slowdown effect and required to be either closed down or renewed in different ways. And the new, say, renewable power generation methodologies, solar panels, wind turbines, etc., would require to be sustainably reprocessed, recycled, and put to rest. How does this happen, and how do you see that happening? You know, Jamshid, perhaps we've spoken about this earlier, and would you guide us on this? And then over to you, Margaret.
Yeah, Ravi, I think this whole issue of managing waste, and I would include in that this whole movement on plastics and packaging, and these are difficult questions, in terms of how. What I have seen in India is that the non-government sector, actually has been the most effective in waste management and recycling and reuse. I think the government agencies that have been sort of tasked to manage both urban and other waste. And I would now start including, we don't talk about it enough, but medical waste. I think the whole issue of COVID has clearly indicated, how much medical waste there is and will add to it because of all the protective equipments, etc. What we need is a formalization, in a sense, by government agencies of using the informal sector. The informal sector, has they have the people, they know how to work with people much better than government agencies do that. I think women have been at the forefront of all of this to a very, very large extent. I think they have not only, not only have they formed these cooperative movements, but they've been very innovative in the way that they have actually adopted many ideas and taken that forward. So for instance, this we 10 years ago we used to say that the greatest invention for consumer products was the sachet. So for 1 rupee you got a shampoo sachet, and everybody who could not afford shampoo could now afford shampoo. Now we realize that yes, of course, it did a lot for the shampoo industry and for women who were using it. But we now realize that it has created so much waste that we never realized at the time and questioned at the time that, what is the plastic that you're using? Is it can it be collected? Can it be recycled? Can it be reused? These are the questions that we have to now ask for all types of, the circular economy is so critical, for sustainability and the future, that we can't afford not to ask these questions anymore.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Botu. Thank you. Margaret, over to you for your comments.
Well, thank you very much. This is an issue where I think it's one of the rare ones that we work on as an organization at WWF, where people can actually do something themselves. We always struggle with describing the scale of the climate challenge, describing the scale of the challenge of biodiversity loss, and you run the risk of leaving people feeling like the problems are so big there's nothing you can do. Waste, there's something you can immediately do. It's being thoughtful about what you buy, how you use it, how you dispose of it when you're done with it, and all the way through the chain, from the individual to the company to the public services around waste management, all the way up to something that we've been working on, which is an international agreement on reducing plastic pollution, because we're finding it everywhere. It's on our plate. We're eating on average something like a credit card a week or something crazy. It's really come to be a challenge, reflective of just how thoughtless we can be as human beings. We look around at the world and we just assume, the water is there for us to use as we please, and it's always going to be there. The trees are there to use as we please. It's always going to be there. I think what we're finding now more and more, that those resources and the services that come, like the ability of the atmosphere to absorb CO2, is not infinite. If we want to be able to live on an earth that is hospitable to us. I mean, the earth will go on, the planet will adjust. The question is whether or not it's a place that we're able to live. So I think this is an issue that's really really key and really reflective of our broader interaction with the world around us, and a responsibility that we all need to take as individuals, and in our professional lives, in our political lives, really to make a difference in how we treat the world.
Okay, thank you very much. That was actually the last of the questions and the last of the remarks. We would like to close shortly, close on time. Just before close, I'd like to offer some example of my own. Mr. Rosha spoke about Bombay, his hometown. Mr. Godrej, of course, knows this aspect very well, lived in Mumbai. Mumbai is my second city, so I lived there, worked there, friends very close to the city myself. One of the experiences I've had is that if you stand on Apollo Bandar in 1975 through to about 1980, every day you would see the peak of Karnala on the other side of the bay, almost every day. And I repeat a comment of a friend of mine who said that in the old days, you could see Karnala every day. Now you see Karnala very, very few days. I mean, you see the stars more often than you see Karnala. And this is what, maybe 20 kilometers or less across, maybe 25 kilometers across the way. And that's in Mumbai, where we have a sea breeze which moves the pollution out of the city, brings it back in during the afternoon, but most of it disperses. And Delhi, where as a child I have seen the far peaks of the Himalayas, the Garhwal Himalaya, from a place about 40 odd miles of Delhi. And it still could be possible, may have been possible here as well. So when Mr. Sinha talked about the distance he was able to see from his apartment and the features that were there, these are things that are not exactly stuff of legend or something, but these are actually things that happen. And in a way, those are valuable indicators of our environment and sustainability, and bring us back to the point of transition and the green economy all the way back. I have many anecdotes like that, and so if you can, favorite topics, you can go on for a very long time. I must thank all of you for being here and for your comments and your insights and your remarks. I must thank you for your, these are not just ordinary comments. These are actually very involved conversations that lead to many things, leads to inspirations, leads to guidance, lead to policy. and some of us, it leads to action. Thank you. There is no vote of thanks to the moderator. I'm the moderator myself, but I'm thanking all of you, and look forward to engaging you further sometimes in the future. And Margaret, thank you for getting up early in the morning and being with us. Bye-bye.
And thank you to you, Ravi.
Thank you very
Thank
much,
you.
Ravi. It's a pleasure to see you. Real pleasure to have a discussion today.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
See
you,
all.
everyone.
Yeah.
Really
Bye-bye.
appreciate
And thank
it.
you to my team. Thank you, Bhavna. Thank you, others.
Yeah, thank you.